Welcome to Fireside Chat, a webinar series brought to you by the Strategic Accounts team at Edwards, a carrier company, where we highlight subject matter experts in fire alarm, mass notification, and emergency communications, picking their brains about topics, news, trends, and technology impacting the life safety community as a whole. We hope you enjoyed listening as much as we enjoy collaborating with our guest.
Hello, my name is Fred Rezler. I am a member of the Edwards KITA Strategic Accounts team, and we are delighted to have you with us today and spending a few moments with us to we talk about today's topic in emergency notification, life safety, and emergency communications. We're going to do our level best to make this worth your while, and we thank you for sharing some time with us. So with no further ado, what we'd like to do is introduce today's guest, and that is Mr. Joe Thalheimer from the University of Central Florida. How are you doing, Joe?
I'm doing well, Fred. It's good to be with you.
It's good to be with you too. Thank you for taking some time to meet with us today.
Absolutely.
So, Joe, as I mentioned, you're the Emergency Management Services Director for the University of Central Florida. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us a little bit about UCF.
Sure. So I'm Director of Emergency Management here. I've been in that role for around 3 years. And prior to that, I was the Warning and Communications Coordinator for the University of Central Florida. So what does that mean? So basically, I was responsible for the mass notification systems for UCF collectively. We call it UCF Alert. And that is our wide area mass notification systems, outdoor sirens, in-building systems, and then our distributed recipients, so text message, email, mobile app, things like that. University of Central Florida is based in Orlando, Florida. We're actually about 15 miles to the east of downtown Orlando. Pretty large campus, about 1,500 acres, give or take. We're the 5th largest employer in our region. So a lot of Central Florida has connections to UCF. So if something happens here, it affects a lot of people. Our population, if you factor in faculty, staff, and students, we have about 71,000 undergraduate students, somewhere around 9,000 graduate students, and we have 12,000 employees. That puts us around number 26 on the list if we were counting in terms of our size. So 26 out of 67. So it's a pretty large organization. We have a stadium on campus that seats about 50,000 folks, and then we have an arena that seats about 10,000 people. So we can have all sorts of special events where, it exponentially increases the size of our campus on game days or when maybe we have a concert or something popular. We've even had presidential visits on campus. So yeah, a lot of people in Central Florida touch UCF in some way beyond education. And that's about it.
That's pretty good, Joe. You have a lot on your plate. UCF is essentially, as you mentioned, it's a county. It's its own city. It's its own ecosystem in essence, correct?
Yeah, we're about the size of Daytona Beach, if you want to put it in perspective of a fairly large municipality.
Being on a college campus, Joe has a great deal of experience in all things touching emergency notification and mass notification, and that's what we're going to focus on today. As we look at mass notification from the broad sense, we're going to try to break this presentation up into 3 generic sections. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about system construction, system design factors, things that go into when you're looking at the front end of deployment of emergency communication, of mass notification. After that, we're going to move into construction requirements, construction specifications, construction standards that you have to adhere to, which you want to look at from that perspective. And then finally, we're going to spend some time, we're going to touch on best practices. Joe has been involved, if I'm correct, Joe, you were involved pretty much from the inception of when they started to deploy mass notification at the university. Is that a fair assessment?
I came in about 3 or 4 years after we had begun. The system was significantly smaller than it is today. It's pretty robust today. But yeah, so I have had the last 10 years to, see the ebbs and flows of the industry and, the construction of the system at UCF.
One of the things, for the benefit of people listening, that is interesting, at least to me, about mass notification, about emergency communications, that differentiated a little bit from fire alarm is that while all are governed by NFPA 72, mass notification is slightly different in that the rules, the code that govern the specifics of a deployment of a mass notification system, in this case at a university, are going to be derived by the procedures, the policies, the practices, and the protocols that the facility has in place. So, Joe, let's touch on UCF and what happened from the beginning, or at least from when you were involved. The first rule of
Sure.
thumb is always to get a risk assessment. And I'm assuming that the university did something along those lines.
We did. So we went through and we narrowed down what our potential hazards were and the reality of them happening here. So we went through and we said, what can affect us the most? Well, we knew that, hazardous weather, right? We're in Hurricane Alley here on the peninsula of Florida. Central Florida has more tornadoes per capita than anywhere else in the United States. Now, granted, they're not big storms like you see in Texas, Oklahoma, Alabama, but they're EF0s and EF1s. And so we have a 6-week span in February and March where we see a lot of these tornadoes spin up. And then they're also a byproduct if you're on the northeast quadrant of a hurricane. So we knew that hazardous weather was one of them. Pandemic, ironically enough, when we did our THIRA, this was in 2015, pandemic was high on our list. This could happen. Now, coming out of COVID, we were well prepared for it. And then we, talked about fires, structure fire, wildfire, active assailant, any sort of threat per se, whether it's cyber or there's, a man-made hazard. Those were all factors into how we addressed our THIRA and what protective measures we put in place.
So you mentioned a couple of times now THIRA. For benefit of those who may
Mhm.
not be familiar, and I'll include myself in that number,
Okay.
explain what a THIRA is, please.
Yeah, let me apologize. Emergency management is acronyms. And as much as we always say in all of our trainings, we need to get to plain speak, a lot of acronyms. So THIRA is your threat hazard identification risk assessment. So it's identifying what you are potentially susceptible to and then seeing what is the consequence of being susceptible to that if it were to happen on your campus.
So essentially, then what the THIRA does as a risk assessment, it looks at all the factors that could impact the university and assigns them a weight and said, this is how likely it is, and if it happens, these are the repercussions of this occurrence. Is that a fairly accurate statement right there? All right,
Correct.
cool.
Yeah, it's a standard risk assessment. So, will this happen and what's the consequence of it?
Did you utilize an outside resource for your THIRA, for your risk assessment? Was that done in-house? What was the process for generating that or collecting that information?
Sure. So we were seeking accreditation. So the Emergency Management Accreditation Program, or EMAP as it's called. And one of the things that is required by EMAP standards, they have 64 standards that you have to hit, is conducting a THIRA and including it in your application package. So it was one of those things that was kind of driven by the accreditation process, but was also overdue at the time. So we chose to do it in-house. We had a lot of folks that had experience, with the military doing THIRAs, people that had backgrounds in security and law enforcement. So it was something that was pretty easy for us to do internally because we had a pretty solid understanding of the process.
I'm going to touch on a deliverable of the risk assessment in just a moment, but I guess the next question is how frequently do you or does the university have to revisit that risk assessment? You touched on a few moments ago the pandemic. Was that a fact or was that a threat that had been considered a number of years ago when the university started doing this, or was that because of the most recent pandemic? Is that something that you've had to incorporate and determine how you were going to manage and mitigate and respond to that? Is that how flexible is the data collection itself?
Yeah, so we revisit our THIRA every year
Okay.
to make sure that we're still hitting the threats that are most probable for us. It's interesting that the pandemic was something that had been on our radar the whole 10 years I'm here. In fact, we've done 4 exercises as it relates to preparing for a pandemic. We've configured points of distribution, or pods as they're called, to give out vaccines or to test people and things like that. So we've been doing that for about 10 years. So we had to have benchmarks in place on how we were going to handle a pandemic or something of that nature coming to our campus. So we prepared ourselves with Zika, with West Nile, with H1N1, COVID. So yeah, we were ready for it when it came. In fact, we leaned pretty forward when we saw that COVID was happening in China, when they had about 60,000 people that had it. we started ramping up our operations. So in January of 2020, we were already meeting to discuss what our actions were going to be to mitigate here at the university.
Which is facilitated by the fact that the deliverable, or at least one of the deliverables of the risk assessment of the THIRA, as the university used, is the creation of an emergency response plan. Is that similar to the path that the university went down, the risk assessment, and then depending upon how these uh, circumstances may be weighted and our likelihood, this is how we're going to respond? Was that what is it accurate to say that that was the deliverable of what you guys put together after that?
We wanted to make sure that our THIRA matched our Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan, or CEMP, as it's called in the industry. So we wanted to make sure that for every potential scenario that we had, higher probability item in our THIRA, that we had a robust plan in place to address that item in our THIRA. So yeah, to your point, yes, that's why we did it. And so there were plans that we had in place that as we went through our THIRA, we realized that they needed some more polish to them. So that's what we did. But yes.
So one of the things, and again, this is a bit of a difference between convention, when I say conventional, but like a fire alarm system or a networked fire alarm system and mass notification, emergency communication, is that there has to be a bit of inherent flexibility in the creation of the emergency response plan. So I guess the question that I have is that this isn't simply a matter, when you're reviewing these potential risks and the potential likelihood and how the university wants to respond, these aren't decisions that are made in a vacuum. Would it be fair to say that we have to bring in, and when I say we, obviously I mean you, but you have to bring in other disciplines, other departments, other factors, other groups of people who have to weigh in, as opposed to just the police, just the fire, and just emergency management?
Yeah, so in emergency management, it's all about partnerships, right? And it's all about the relationships that you make across your campus community or your municipal community. We have 28 emergency support functions, or ESFs as we call them. Those are people that are operational policymakers within the university that we work with on a daily basis to make sure our plans incorporate their needs as an operational segment within the university. So we speak to them about, if we have a structure fire, how does this affect you? What do you need in the plan to get you back to as close to normal as possible, for you to recover or you to respond to this particular scenario, whatever it happens to be, whether it's hazardous weather or structure fire or active assailant. So there's that facet of it. But then as we start talking about mass notification specifically, now we're talking about, key partners through facilities operations, from the police department, from IT, and disciplines like that.
It does. It does. And
And
again, one of the reasons I touch on that is that for myself and for a number of people where there may be a great deal of familiarity with straight up fire alarm, a fire alarm project or expansion of a fire alarm system, that's a pretty straightforward process, right? We're going to work with facilities, we're going to work with construction management, we're going to work maybe a little bit with IT, but we're also going to work with PD and the first responders. Mass note, something a little broader than that, is going to require input from more stakeholders to weigh in. And as a matter of fact, that's what chapter 24
Yep.
requires, right? An approved emergency response plan, and approved by all stakeholders. And one of the things that you touched on, it's not just stakeholders even within the university, right? You were getting feedback from the city of Orlando, from Orange County, I would assume as well, correct?
Yeah, even Seminole County, we're on the border of two counties, both Orange and Seminole County. So we've even solicited input from them. And, when we write these plans, we do them internally, but we do bounce them off our colleagues, off of our peers. So yeah, there was a lot of information sharing as it relates to it. And, our main campus isn't our only campus, right? We have other campuses in other jurisdictions. So while we're the emergency management program for the main campus as part of a state university, we do have a downtown campus that resides within the city of Orlando, a med school campus that is, in the city of Orlando. Then we have another hospitality campus that's in Orange County. So yeah, we have to work with all those partners to connect those dots.
So as we move through the process then, what we have is there is a risk assessment, and the deliverable of the risk assessment is the emergency response plan. So now we know what our threats are, and we know how, given a set of threats that we may encounter, we have an idea of what we want our response or our responses to be. So what's the next thing that we're looking at? What's the next thing that we're considering at when we're looking at deploy, or when we're even before that, when we're starting to investigate a mass notification solution? What type of system considerations are you bearing in mind at that point?
There's a lot of factors, and we'll get into the weeds here in a second. But one of the biggest things for us is making sure we're getting value for dollar for the university, right? So we want to make sure that we get a system that's going to last. The last thing you want to do is go to your administration and explain to them that you're going to spend, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars on a system, depending on the scope of it, right? And then, Windows 10 is end of life, and now the system has to be taken offline, and there's no mechanism for replacement. And now we have to start this process all over again 3 years from now because we didn't future-proof the system. I know nothing is future-proof, but you do your best to make sure that happens, right? That there's a long-term consideration. So you have to look at the product that you're going after and say, when did it hit the market? Is this something that has been, sitting on a shelf for 9 years or 10 years or whatnot, and it's kind of at the end of life, and that they're going to come out with the next thing, and then they'll no longer service the system that you have? Is the system upgradable? I mean, when the next latest and greatest comes out, will this system be able to be upgraded? Whether it's hardware upgrades, hard drive upgrades, software upgrades, whatever it happens to be, will you be able to upgrade the system? Is there a planned obsolescence? You have to get with your vendor and say, so, I noticed this has been on the market for X amount of years. Is there a plan for this to go obsolete? Or is this something that I can, hang my hat on, 5 years from now when my successor is in this position or whatnot, that it'll still be around? And then let's talk about the company itself, the company you're going to biz with. There's a lot of companies out there that have good ideas and have neat stuff, but ultimately, what does the business solvency look like? What does it look like in terms of their financial readiness moving into the future? Is this a company that hasn't got their first big client yet and they're looking for you to be their guinea pig? Or is this somebody that's been in the industry for 150 years, building these systems? So that's one of the things that you really want to consider is how long, they've been in the game, how long will the system last, and what's the expected life expectancy of it?
And not to pry too much or to throw too much out there. This is actually after the fact, after a decision had been made. This was a situation that you ran into fairly recently, where a system where where the university had invested considerable time and resources, where it wasn't so much a planned obsolescence as an immediate obsolescence that you were forced to kind of scramble your way through. Correct?
Correct. That's right.
Yeah. And again, we don't have to go into a lot of detail about that. So what we're looking for is a solution. We're vetting the characteristics of the company or companies that we want to partner with, and see how viable it is and how long of term of a solution this will be. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, in these conversations, is the university working directly with manufacturers or with installers or with engineers, or who's collecting this information? How does that look?
So being a state university, we have certain procurement guidelines that we have to go with. We can have a general idea of the type of system that we want to use, and we'll use an example, the outdoor speaker arrays that we have here on our campus, right? We can say that we'd like to add on to those outdoor speaker arrays, and unless we have a specific feature that only one vendor has, it becomes a position where we have to put it out for bid, and we have to tell them we are looking for speaker arrays that can do X amount of coverage at this level of intelligibility, 15 dBs above ambient noise, and then we solicit that out there, and people can bid on the process. So then a bunch of people go ahead, or a bunch of corporations submit invitations to select their product, and we go through line by line to see what kind of bells and whistles the product has beyond the stuff that we have specifically asked for. That's when we're doing our, our due diligence in terms of what we're getting for our money ultimately. It doesn't necessarily always come down the price, but rather the value for your dollar.
And that's an interesting thing that I'd like to spend a couple minutes talking about. When you're trying to gauge the value that a system can provide, right? As you're bringing it into an existing in ecosystem, again to use the word, when you're bringing something new in, what criteria are you using to you say you're going line by line, but what are you going line by line? What are you looking for? Are you looking for how well with the system, how easy is it to use? How well will it play with, what we have? What is it that, and when I say you, obviously I mean the university as a whole, but what are those things that you're line by lining, that you're trying to gauge the value, the bang for your buck on? Does the question make sense?
Yeah, it does. So, one of the things that we looked at is because we had so many disparate systems for different things, right? Digital signage, we had a system for a mobile app for our students. We had a system for that, and we had, a text system and a email system and stuff like that. We wanted to kind of pull everything together and make it work as one cohesive unit. And so we really looked at what the integration possibilities for our system were. What, a one-stop shop. We go to a GUI, a graphical user interface for another acronym.
I
And
did know that one.
okay, good. So we go to the GUI and we want to be able to launch from one system, not disparate systems. Because when you're talking these emergency scenarios, let's use a tornado, for example. Average lead time from the National Weather Service on a tornado is 13 minutes. You don't want to be fumbling around. Let me launch my digital signage. Let me launch my mobile app. Let me launch my text message. You want to go to one-stop shop and have that GUI, and you want to be able to launch to all of your endpoints simultaneously. So what we looked at was how can we tie those together? Does this system have the ability to do CAP, another acronym, Common Alerting Protocol? That's the language that all these alerting systems speak, a common language that they speak, and that allows them to talk to each other. So if I'm sending out a text message through this system, it's also telling the outdoor speaker sirens they have to send out their message as well. Can you use RSS feeds or rich site summary feeds? So can you trigger your signage by that? You get your scrolling text on your digital signage or on your televisions on campus. And then are there APIs that can be worked behind the scenes, software integrations behind the scenes to tie these disparate systems together so that your end user, your police dispatcher, your security office, your firefighters, whomever that are launching these messages, they don't have to know, what's in the secret sauce. They just know that it works, ultimately works. So those are the things that you're going line by line to see how easy you can make it for your end user and get the most value for your dollar. Implement the most possible things while making it easy to use.
So what we're talking about is we know we're bringing in a new system. You want to be able to leverage any infrastructures or systems that are in place. You touched on a distributed recipient platform. I'm assuming that also, with the existing fire alarm systems in a given building, you touched on the outdoor notification. So that's what you're looking at. Not only how well does this meet our needs now, but also how well does it work with the infrastructure we have in place now. And then on top of that, you're looking at, okay, how well will this position us for the next, 3, 5, 7, 10 years? Is that kind of, did I fumble through that? But is that similar to what you were saying?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying. And I mentioned earlier that, it's not all about cost. I mean, there's a cost component to it. Obviously, anytime you're talking about spending, thousands of dollars on anything, there's a cost component to it. But we also look at from a cost aspect of it, the upfront cost is one thing, right? But what are the reoccurring costs? Does the system that you're going for have an annual licensing fee, right? If I have 100 buildings on the mass notification system, are they going to expect me to pay $500 per year for 100 buildings that I might not have the reoccurring dollars for? Are there hosting fees if it's a cloud-based service, right? Do I have to pay for the amount of data that I send out to be to be stored as well. We're a sunshine law state, so anything that we have here is stored for 30 days. So if it's a cloud hosted thing, we have to store that stuff in the cloud for 30 days so that we could pull it.
A
Yes,
sunshine
sir.
law state, Joe?
Yeah, so sunshine law means that anything that we do here becomes a public record in essence. People have the ability to reach out to the university and say, hey, we would like your public records for your mass notification system logs for the last 30 days, and we have to be able to provide them. So again, if we're cloud hosting stuff for distributed recipient and we've sent out, 50 alerts over the last 30 days, we got to make sure that they're A, accessible to us, and B, we're not paying a ton of money in hosting that. And then any sort of network fees, right? If to ride on your computer network, there's network drops that need to be done, or configuration of VLANs, or anything related to network, make sure it's not a reoccurring thing. And if you have endpoints that don't have network going to them, as we do at UCF, we use radios, but there's sometimes a cellular option that you could use, and now you're paying for a SIM card every month for that service. So that's maybe $50 a month that you have to factor in. So yeah, it's nice to know all those costs line by line up front and to consider them rather than it might not seem too expensive for your initial cost that they cut the PO for, but then next year when it comes time to renew all those ancillary things, now you have thousands of dollars that you're looking at and you just didn't consider them.
All right, we've talked about THIRA, we've talked about the risk assessment, we've talked about the development of the emergency response plan, and we started to talk about the system considerations, things to look at when we're beginning to implement a system. So we've covered a lot of ground. Joe, thank you so much. I'm assuming we can have you back to talk about a couple other items.
Yeah, let's do it. Absolutely.
All right, good deal. Thank you so much.
This seems like a good note to go out on. We'd like to thank our guest for spending some time with us today and for sharing their expertise and knowledge. We'd also like to thank you for listening in and encourage you to listen next time. If you have any questions or would like to reach out to Edwards, please email us below and we'll get back to you as quickly as possible. Thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day.